Hello, my name is Andrew Geary, and welcome to Seismic Sound Off, in-depth conversations in applied geophysics. In this insider's look at the leading edge, I'm joined by Laura Chiaramonte, technical leader in the Advanced Generation Sector CO2 Capture and Storage Group at the Electric Power Research Institute. We will discuss TLE's January special section on carbon dioxide in the subsurface. In this engaging conversation, Laura and I discuss the importance of this topic for applied geophysics, key takeaways from each paper, and what one mystery she hopes to solve as a geophysicist. For links to this month's special section, visit scg.org/podcast. Now for our conversation. So this was a new topic for me, exploring carbon dioxide in the subsurface. So just so I can understand a little bit better, could you briefly explain the importance or provide the importance of this topic for applied geophysics?
Yes, sure. So carbon dioxide in the injection in the subsurface has been going on for a long time, especially in this country for several decades. The oil industry has used CO2 to actually enhance recovery of oil. Traditionally, the CO2 injection, so the oil industry had to buy the CO2, so it was an added cost, and the focus was to minimize the amount of CO2 to be used in order to maximize the secondary recovery of the oil. So there was no much attention regarding what happened to this CO2. The focus was to try not to lose anything that needed to be replaced, so to keep costs down. And a lot of the effort was with traditional applied geophysical methods on formation evaluation to make sure that the CO2 flood was going to work there, and flow simulations to understand how it works, etc. But with the later recognition of climate change and also the recognition of the need to limit the CO2 emissions to the atmosphere, one of the technologies that is very strong proposed to minimize this release of CO2 is carbon sequestration. So basically capture the CO2 from, there are different ways. So you can capture it in large power plant or large point sources, or some people propose direct air capture. And the idea is once you capture, you transport it and you inject it underground. So one of the strongest proposals for injecting the CO2 to have an impact on emission reduction is actually to inject it in saline formations that are everywhere, or perhaps depleted oil and gas reservoirs where we know that there is a reservoir and a trap for a fluid and you could store the CO2 there securely. But an intermediate step would be the utilization of the CO2, and this is where the traditional enhanced oil recovery with CO2 comes in. So you use the CO2 to extract oil, but then later on you make sure that you are putting the CO2 in the subsurface. So then there is an added use of applied geophysics, which is actually to monitor the CO2, because it wouldn't make sense to spend millions of dollars injecting the CO2 trying to sequester it if later on it actually goes to another part of the reservoir and starts leaking and it seeps its way again to the atmosphere. So the monitoring of the CO2 has become a very important application of geophysics.
It's an interesting history that got us to where this is relevant for applied geophysics there. Before we look at the papers individually, what resonated with you while you were working on this special section?
So there are two parts that resonated for me. One is, I guess, a surprise. We as researchers, we see it every day, but seeing everything together is like how much our knowledge has increased with time from early work. So that is impressive, and of course we have much more work to do. And the other thing is that that more and more, so as I mentioned in this history of CO2, there was the traditional focus on the oil industry of using the CO2, and then this focus on sequestration that comes as a climate mitigation strategy. And actually, more and more, you're seeing how in the oil industry, there is this recognition that CO2 emissions should be limited, and how it more uses their expertise and combines projects. A couple of the papers actually work both, like there were analyses that are both for utilization of the CO2 or sequestration as well.
Hmm. So starting to look at the individual papers, Gia et al. Explore how to optimize the CO2 huff and puff process and therefore achieve the best enhanced oil recovery performance, especially in tight formations like the Bakken Formation. So what did their particular study highlight?
Well, so again, going a little bit of history also, the CO2 has been traditionally, this CO2 flood has been traditionally used in typical oil reservoirs like permeable sandstones. And with the shale gas revolution and more oil being found in very tight formations, these type of studies are important in trying to understand how the CO2 could be used in this type of environments. And they actually show that the CO2 half and puff process in these type formations, such as the Bakken, could be useful. And they conducted a lot of sensitivity analysis to try to understand how the CO2 injection rate, the oil production time, and the soaking. So basically that means like when you inject the CO2, how long do you leave it in the formation before trying to extract the oil? What was the impact for the incremental oil recovery factor? Because one of the biggest issues in this type formation is like the oil recovery factor is very low. So they actually show, several conclusions from their study, but it's showing promising results of using the CO2 in impermeable formation.
So Wang et al. Focused their study on a thinly layered heterogeneous systems such as the Ordos Basin in Western China, jumping around the world here. What were a couple of their key takeaways?
So one of the takeaways, and again, this is coming from my focus on more permanently store the CO2 in the subsurface. It was very interesting to read this study in the Ordos Basin in China and how they are actually trying to study both the injecting the CO2 for oil recovery as well as for sequestration. But it was very interesting to see that they were doing core flooding experiments focusing on the reservoir damage that it could be caused for precipitations when asphaltene precipitations when you are injecting the CO2. And this is again to try to find the best. They compare two different recovery techniques, only injecting CO2 or actually alternating CO2 with water, to try to give a better understanding of which are the better techniques for recovering the oil.
Speaking of better techniques, in Vasco et al., that paper provides a review of two different geodetic techniques, such as satellite-based interferometric synthetic aperture radar. It's an interesting word there, and they're used in CO2 storage monitoring programs. So what captured your imagination in reading about these particular two field cases?
So there are two things that are very interesting for me here. One is, it's very promising to see that how these geodetic techniques that allows a much more temporally resolution on monitoring techniques and lower the cost considerably comparing to other traditional techniques like 3D seismic methods. These techniques that allow us to recover much more information at lower cost and therefore allow us for a better monitoring of the fluid movement in the subsurface it's something that is very, very promising. I mean, some of these techniques are already established, and one of the things that it was very positively promising for me, is the fact that one of the case studies was in an active enhanced oil recovery operation. So basically, you are injecting the CO2, but at the same time, you are extracting the oil. So the dynamics in the reservoir are very complex. There is a lot of noise in the data recovered, and they were able to still be able to observe important information that could be used to try to identify the phase of the fluid on the reservoirs. So that was one of the highlights for me of the paper, to show that even in a noisy environment, these techniques could help you monitor the reservoir. And the other one that is also very promising is So basically what they are doing is just understanding, they are measuring surface deformation, and they are using it to try to understand the fluid flow on the reservoir. And the way that they are doing it's actually kind of an inverse problem. So they basically try to solve for volume, for reservoir volume change or an aperture change if there is an evolving fracture. And by putting it as an inverse problem, what they are doing is actually simplifying it into a mechanical problem. And you don't need like complex reservoir models or coupled reservoir fluid models with geomechanics, which slow down a lot the analysis, but at the same time, it introduces a lot of uncertainty because then you have much more parameters that you need to solve. So by simplifying this problem, it allows us to have a rapid sampling and a quick turnaround for images of these, and even if you even more if you combine it with in-depth measurements, which for example the authors mention a couple like strain determination from time-lapse seismic analysis or fiber optic cables for strain measurements. If you combine both of them and you have this quick turnaround on the analysis of the data, you can even be talking about real-time monitoring of the CO2 movement, or if you're considering in areas where you have the risk of induced seismicity, you can also be kind of analyzing the real-time progression of fractures. So that is something that is being done in some areas, but when you're considering things that are so deep and with so much data, is still in early processes, but it's very, very promising.
There is a lot to unpack and explore in that paper there. And now looking at the last paper in the special section, there's 4 in this month's special section. Zakharova et al. Explored the sequestration potential of the Newark Basin. And they provide a summary of geologic and geophysical research performed in that basin over the last 2 decades. The basin potential for CO2 storage appears low, but select formation properties are promising. Why do the authors conclude that the potential could be low, and what formation properties might be promising?
Yeah, so basically what you are looking, the CO2 sequestration world, it follows a pattern very similar to the oil industry. So this paper goes more to an kind of like exploration stage in which you don't know, you're looking at the whole basin and you don't know much of what are the characteristics of the formation, and you try to identify which will be the optimal targets. And ideally, what you need is a high permeable formation that could receive the CO2 and that has big, large storage capacity, so porosity permeability. And one added consideration in the case of CO2 is that you need to have very strong seals or impermeable formations and on the top of it in order to make sure that the CO2 won't escape. In addition to that, so you could have very much more less permeable formations that which will reduce your capacity. But in addition to that, they explore, for example, other type of formations such as basalt. Those basalt, they are crystalline rock that they don't have permeability or porosity in the rock itself, but that is actually given by fracture. So a lot of people propose that those could be good sequestration targets, and the CO2 could interact with the basalt and actually be mineralized and permanently trapped there. But in order to do that, what you need is that you need to make sure even more that you have strong seals that will prevent the CO2 from migrating rapidly to the surface, because these fractures that will be your storage volumes or storage space are actually, the CO2 could migrate through them much more rapidly, if it makes sense.
Yes.
Am I answering?
You are question? Answering. Yeah, that does make sense there. And there's always the paper for people to read as well to seek further details of what you're explaining there. So kind of jumping back to where we started with some of your looking at the special section, what was one thing that surprised you from these papers?
So I guess, so as a surprise, I would say this possibility of actually have a real-time powerful monitoring techniques. I don't know if I would call it surprising, because there is strong body of research on that, and it's definitely what people are trying to achieve. But it definitely makes it seem achievable, and that is very promising.
What do you hope readers of this special section will take away from these 4 papers?
I would hope they kind of have a sense of the broad application of geophysics with working with CO2, what CO2 is useful for, and what do we need, what are the challenges, and what do we need to focus on in order to, this is very biased towards my research, but basically what the technical challenge and the effort we need to focus in order, if we use CO2 sequestration to reduce carbon emissions to the atmosphere, just to make it to do it in a safe and technically sound way.
One final question here. If you could just solve one mystery as a scientist, what would you solve?
So I would say, so one of the things that I would like to answer as a scientist would be, in a lot of the research that I'm involved, which has to do with assuring a safe deployment of CCS, of carbon sequestration in the subsurface, or perhaps a safe exploitation of thermal energy from the earth in geothermal technologies, one of the biggest issues and risks is whether by doing that you are actually increasing the likelihood of microseismicity or even bigger seismicity. So, and that is directly related how the mechanical aspects of how the rocks behave. So that would be a very interesting topic that it's directly related to the preventions of earthquakes, and that is definitely very appealing. On the other spectrum, and I'm cheating because it's not only one, but one thing that I would love to solve is how to influence human behavior to be able to tackle things that are absolutely recognized. For example, in climate change, I think it's maybe not everyone, but it's a very, very strong majority and a lot of will to do things to help tackle the climate change issue and an emergency that we are living. But there is a lot of political and perhaps inertia issues on taking measurements toward that. So trying to solve how the mind works in order to create more action, that would be also something very appealing, but it's very general.
That would be very appealing to me as well. So I like that we're going to solve that one together. Is there anything I should have asked you that I did not?
Yeah, perhaps one question could be if there is a big topic or an important topic to solve regarding CO2 that is not shown in the papers that they were submitted.
Did a particular topic come to mind while you were reviewing these 4 papers?
Yes. So, for example, one of the biggest issues for me, and again, this is my bias because this is what I'm looking at, but I do believe that is one of the stronger ones, is that when you are actually talking about putting CO2 in the subsurface or putting largest amount of any other fluids like wastewater disposal, etc., one of the biggest hazards and issues to be solved is the potential for induced seismicity or larger seismic events. So I think a submission on the advances that have been done studying induced seismicity would be something important. And there are many work out there, so like if the reader or the listener is interested on that, they could find work on that. But definitely keep in mind that that's a big issue.
Well, wonderful. I really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness in answering these questions and for putting you on the spot about what mysteries you're going to solve. So
sorry about that. I mean, it was a difficult question.
It's a very difficult question, but sometimes when you're researching, it's good to just think a little bigger sometimes. And so thank you for thinking on it and all these questions, and appreciate your time editing this special section as well.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to SEG's flagship podcast. Please share this episode with a friend, colleague, or manager that would enjoy hearing this episode. Your recommendation is the single best action you can take on behalf of SEG's podcast. Go to our website at seg.org/podcast to find all our episodes and learn how you can listen to this podcast directly on your phone without downloading an app. Original music by Zach Bridges. This episode was hosted, edited, and produced by me, Andrew Geary. The SEG podcast team is Jennifer Crockett, Allie McGinnis, and Mick Swiney. Thank you for listening. This is Seismic Sound Off, signaling off.